Yeah, so as Putty said, my name is Chris Lee. I'm a philosophy student at Southwestern. And again, she thanked me for coming, but I'd like to thank you guys for being here, for opening an opportunity for me to speak on this, hot, controversial, political topic on transsexuality and human flourishing. I hope we're going to have some fun today. But as Putty said, really, I've only been researching or interested in this topic for about a year now. Last March, I spoke at a philosophy conference in New Orleans. I presented a paper titled, "Is the Soul Sexed?" And it was on the metaphysics of gender. And it was really a technical, philosophical paper where I argued for the affirmative that, yes, our souls or minds, because those two are used interchangeably in the literature, our minds or souls are inherently sexed. And after the conference, after the Q&A, people came up and they asked, why did you write this paper? How did you come to even get started on writing this paper? And I was honest, because most people don't think about that. I don't know, most people at the conference didn't. I don't know if any of you have ever thought about whether or not souls are sexed. But I'll be honest, that thought just came to me one day. As I was listening to the rhetoric of the transgenderism movement, the trans activists, as I was listening to their verbiage, something just kind of struck me as odd. It was kind of unsettling. It wasn't the manner in which they presented, or again, because that could be unsettling, but it was the words that they were saying, the arguments that they were making were unsettling to me as a philosopher. Just listening to their points, I just realized, we're going to talk about some of these later, but I noticed some contradictions, some inconsistencies in worldview, some epistemic problems in their arguments. And from there, that's really where my research interest in this topic began, and I've kind of been presenting it at places, and thankfully I'm here to present to you as well. But I want to be clear before we begin about what it is that I'm going to be doing. Again, this is a hot, political, and sensitive topic for some. I believe that we need to tread carefully, with compassion, with discernment. Again, I don't know you guys personally. I don't know if you or someone close to you is struggling with this, whether or not you're considering transitioning or in the process of transitioning or have transitioned. I don't know if you have friends or family members, loved ones who are wrestling with this. But I do understand that what we're dealing with are fundamentally people, right? And we as Christians believe that human beings are created in the image of God, valuable, worthy before their Maker's eyes. And so I want to tread very carefully and very compassionately. Knowing this, I want us to adopt a posture that really wants to love our trans neighbors. And so this is the key question that I want us to kind of work towards answering. What is the most loving and helpful response to those living with a debilitating sense of gender dysphoria? What is the most loving thing we can do? Because a lot of, again, media likes to play this up, but what evangelicals are posted at, we're called transphobic. People are attacking the Christian belief and saying, you guys are hateful towards the trans community. You are hateful. And they like to argue that they're the ones who are loving. They're loving, but I want you to understand that my posture is one that I truly do want to love my trans neighbor the best possible way. I want to provide the most helpful response to those living with this dysphoria. And so just to give a quick overview of what we're going to do, how we're going to proceed, first I'm going to lay out the ideas and the philosophies promoted by trans activists. This is essentially where I'm just going to be telling you what they're saying, what they're arguing for, straight from their mouths. What is the arguments from the trans activists? Then two, I want to make three appeals. I want to make a philosophical appeal, a medical, biological / psychological appeal, and an emotional appeal for why I think that these ideas that are being promoted by trans activists is harmful. Why these are three appeals for why we should reject the philosophies that are undergirding and promoting this transgender ideology. And then third, I want us to get practical, get to the main question of, okay, how can we best love our trans neighbors? And so the idea is we're going to begin with the concept. We're going to begin with the concept of transgenderism, and then transition to take care of the person. And again, I'm going to have some time for Q&A where you guys can ask any question you want, and that's kind of how we'll wrap this up. But I want you guys to understand that there is absolutely no way that I can really exhaustively cover all that I want to in a single meeting. right? And honestly, I have these notes here, but chances are I'm going to have to skip around. I might not cover everything that I even want to cover here. If I really wanted to give a full, robust explanation, I may have to come, weeks after, for a whole month maybe, but you guys don't want that, trust me. And so just be with me with that. Understand that essentially what we're going to be doing is just scratching the surface. And hopefully this will encourage you, pique your interest to go and do some of this research when you have the time. So with all that laid out, let's get started. But let me preface that by, before we get to the body of the talk, I want to start by defining some terms. I don't want there to be any confusion. Again, I may be using some terms that I mean one thing, but you take it to mean something else. And I don't want there to be any miscommunication, any misunderstandings. And so I want us to be on the same page when we're using these terms. And I'm sorry that the PowerPoint is very small. I did not realize, again, I kind of came in here not knowing what to expect. But let me just go through it. So when I say things like biological sex, it refers to the physical, biological, and anatomic dimensions of being a male or female. And so it has to do with the biological aspects. Gender, it's the psychological, social, and cultural aspects of being male or female. Gender identity is how you experience yourself or think of yourself as male or female, including how masculine or feminine a person feels. Then we have gender roles, the adoption of cultural expectations for maleness or femaleness. Gender dysphoria, it is the experience of distress associated with the incongruence wherein one's psychological and emotional gender identity does not match one's biological identity. And this is typically what is characterized for those who identify as a woman trapped in a man's body or man trapped in a woman's body. And then transgender, again, it's an umbrella term for many ways in which people might experience and or present and express their gender identities differently from people whose sense of gender identity is congruent with their biological sex. And a couple more. Again, this is the philosopher in me that wants to be very clear and very strict like this, but transsexual. It's a person who believes he or she was born in the wrong body of the other sex and wishes to transition or has transitioned through hormonal treatment and sex reassignment surgery. Cisgender, it's a word to contrast with transgender and to signify that one's psychological and emotional experience of gender identity is congruent with their biological sex. Gender fluid, it's this term when a person wants to convey that their experience of gender is not fixed. It's either male or female, but it also may be both. It may be neither. It fluctuates. It's along a continuum encompassing qualities of both gender identities and the intersex. It's a term to describe a condition in which a person is born with sex characteristics or anatomy that does not allow for clear identifications as male or female. Again, the causes of an intersex condition may be chromosomal, gonadal, or genital. And again, I'm going to be clear from the beginning. I will not be speaking about intersex or intersex individuals. I know that there exists a dynamic community of intersex people, but at the same time, I don't think that the existence of the intersex condition is a good argument for the abolition of binary. I don't think that because intersex people exist that we should just get rid of this binary understanding of gender. Again, as a general principle, we do not make rules for the exceptions, but we acknowledge that there are exceptions to the rule. And so with this kind of general understanding, let's get into it. Again, I think these PowerPoints are available, and I'm willing to share it to anyone who wants it, and along with these notes as well, just to let me know, and we'll talk afterwards. But the transgender ideology. Now, not too long ago, most Americans have never heard of transgender identity. But it's really within the past couple of years, a relatively short period of time, where it's become a cause that's claiming a mantle in civil rights. Again, you'd be hard-pressed to find a TV show or a movie in mainstream media where the transgender ideology is not represented, if not just promoted. All right, just in the past week, former NBA star Dwayne Wade, have you guys heard this story? It's in the headlines. It was in USA Today, NBC News, Business Insider, literally every news outlet. He was on Ellen to announce that he and his wife, Gabriella Union, are pretty much in support of their 12-year-old child who identifies as a transgender female. The 12-year-old Zion will now be called Zaya, and Dwayne and Gabriella celebrated Zaya's pronoun change. She is now their 12-year-old daughter, and the road to transitioning will begin now. It is now the mainstream view that social and medical transitioning is the appropriate treatment for people, including children, who feel at odds with their biological sex. A discordant gender identity is said to represent who the person really is, in contrast to the sex assigned at birth. And any failure to accept this, any failure to support a transgender identity is equated to bigotry, and not treating people as the gender that they claim to be is discriminatory. Why? Because again, in today's day and age, where we're operating under this postmodern metaphysics, there is this radical idea about the human person. Namely, people are what they claim to be, regardless of contrary evidence. And what I mean by transgender metaphysics is this: people simply are the gender that they claim to be. A transgender boy is a boy and thus should be treated like all other boys. And a transgender girl is a girl and thus should be treated like any other girl. Again, this kind of idea has drastic implications from the political realm, but I'm not going to address that in this talk. But no longer should we say that a transgender boy is a biological girl who identifies as a boy, or that a transgender girl is a biological boy who identifies as a girl. We now have to assert that people are the sex they claim to be. Again, you see this language being promoted in the literature, where the Human Rights Campaign, they published a work called The Transgender American, a handbook for understanding, and this was back in 2005. This is kind of where we see this language beginning to emerge. They said that gender dysphoria, as a person's, gender dysphoria is defined as a person's discomfort from the strong internal sense that their true gender identity does not match their physical sex. Again, they're smuggling these ideas in. Your true gender identity is what you believe you are, not your biological sex. If you go to their website now, this is the advice, and what you'll see is the original bold and italics. This is their advice to journalists who are reporting on transgender individuals. They say, refrain from contrasting trans men and women with real or biological men and women. Contrasting gender people with real or biological men and women is a false comparison. They are real men and women, and doing so contributes to the inaccurate perception that transgender people are being deceptive when in fact they are being authentic and courageous. This is the posture that is adopted by and promoted by even the medical community. Dr. Deanna Atkins, she is a professor of Duke University School of Medicine. She's also the director of Duke Center for Child and Adolescent Gender Care. This is what she says. From a medical perspective, the appropriate determinant of sex is gender identity. Again, she argues that gender identity, what your subjective sense of what you feel or what gender you identify as, gender identity is not only the preferred basis for determining sex, but the only medically supported determinant of sex. Every other method is bad science, she claims. She says that it is counter to medical science to use chromosomes, hormones, internal reproductive organs, external genitalia, or secondary sex characteristics to override gender identity for the purposes of classifying someone as male or female. Again, what is gender identity? It is a person's inner sense of belonging to a particular gender, such as male or female. But that is the overriding factor in classifying and determining an individual's sex from a medical point of view. Now, interestingly enough, Atkins doesn't talk about whether or not she would apply this rule to other mammalian species, but here's a quick point I'd like to make. One of the things that we see going on with this movement is a complete severing of gender from biology. What determines your sex is fundamentally what is between your ears, not what's between your legs. Right? Forget chromosomes, internal and external reproductive organs. What you believe is your gender identity just is your gender. Now, Atkins asserts that being transgender is also not a mental disorder, but simply a normal development deviation. And this understanding, again, is now common. Prior to the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, it's published by the American Psychiatric Association. Prior to the DSM-5, being transgender was considered a mental disorder. But with the updated DSM-5, there's now been a shift away from gender identity disorder towards the use of the phrase gender dysphoria to reduce the stigma. Trans-affirming therapists even insist that trying to explore the why question, why a person has gender dysphoria, instead of immediately accepting it as that person's authentic self, is offensive, it's bigoted, it's transphobic. Any attempt to stigmatize gender dysphoria will not be accepted. Again, this ideology is also what's being promoted to our children. I don't know if you are familiar with what's known as the gender unicorn. Have you guys seen the gender unicorn? If you haven't, here it is. This is a graphic created by the Trans Student Educational Resources. Clearly, it's targeting children. This graphic represents the different spectrums, characteristics of sexuality and gender, with each of them falling along a spectrum, and all of them are independent of one another. So first we have gender identity. Gender identity at the top. This is how you, in your head, define your gender based on how much you align or don't align with what you understand to be the options for gender. So you could be a female, woman, girl, male, man, boy, or others. Then you have the gender expression, which is how you present your gender through your actions, through your dress, or demeanor. And third, we have sex assigned at birth, female, male, other sex. But one thing I want to point out about this, the sex assigned at birth, it does smuggle in a certain assumption, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But before there was a gender unicorn, I don't know if you know this, but there was actually a gingerbread person. A gingerbread person, but again, the trans activists were kind of upset at this because they said that it looked overly male. But the second thing that they were upset about is before, where it says sex assigned at birth, they had biological sex. And they were kind of upset at that. They wanted to get that changed, which is why it's now the gender unicorn, which is an imaginary creature, neither male or female. And so I guess they're okay with that now. But they changed the biological sex assigned at birth. Again, it's smuggling in this idea that there is a severing of biology from sex, and implying that sex is not something that we're actually born with, but something that our doctors or our parents just assign us, give it to us arbitrarily at birth. This is externally assigned, but says nothing of who you actually are. And then at the bottom, we have the physical attracted to and emotionally attracted to. It talks about sexual orientation. And so when you look at the gender unicorn, this is what it tells us. Gender identity, the rainbow, is in the mind. Your sex assigned at birth, it's between your legs. Physical attracted to, emotional attraction, that's in your heart. And your gender expression is everywhere else. This is kind of the idea that's being promoted. It's an attempt to inform kids early on of gender identity, because it's insisted that gender identity is innate and established at a very young age, and it is immutable. Again, this is what children are learning. And again, none of these are all independent of one another. If I wanted to, I can identify as a female, but express myself masculinely, be other sex at birth while I'm physically attracted to women and emotionally attracted to men. I mean, none of those, they're all independent of one another. And pretty much you can explore your gender sexuality and your gender identity as you please. And what's also being promoted, again, is at a very young age. Doctors are claiming that children's gender identities are fixed and immutable. Dr. George Brown, a professor of psychiatry, a 3-time board member of the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, pretty much says that gender identity is usually established early in life by the age of 2 or 3. Okay? Atkins states that evidence strongly suggests that gender identity is innate or fixed at a young age, and that gender identity has a strong biological basis. But one thing to note, she at no point actually points or cites to any evidence or sources for any of these claims. Again, this is from a court case when they introduced a House 9 bill in North Carolina. And again, these are all you can find all of these online, the actual cases. But again, she cites no evidence that's strongly suggested, but they say that there's a strong biological basis for this. Again, in seeking evidence for a biological basis for transgender identity, a lot of activists point to what is known as brain sex theory. Right? Much of the evidence, this is what Dr. Brown says, much of the evidence in support of a biological basis for gender identity is based on comparison studies of the brains of transgender people and non-trans people. Atkins says something similar. People with gender dysphoria have brain structures, connectivity, and function that do not match their birth assigned sex. Now, here's the thing. Even if those claims were supported by evidence, which it's not, I think we have good reasons to doubt this. It wouldn't tell us whether the brain differences are a cause of transgender identity or the result of identifying and acting as a transgender individual, because we know about this thing called neuroplasticity. But again, given this understanding that an internal sense of gender determines a person's sex, It isn't surprising that transgender activists are promoting medical remedies designed to affirm your gender identity. Atkins says that the appropriate treatment for individuals who are transgender must focus on alleviating distress through supporting outward expressions of the person's gender identity and bringing the body into alignment with the identity. So the treatment typically begins with supporting a social transitioning, helping the person live as if they are already the opposite sex. This is where you change the pronouns, you change names, you change the way they dress, and eventually it involves transforming the body to make it look like the opposite sex through cross-sex hormones and reconstructive surgery. Dr. Randy Etner, chief psychologist at Chicago Gender Center, pretty much this is the standard care promoted by transgender activists. Social transitioning begins, again, change in gender expression and role, consistent with one's gender identity. We start, again, adopting new pronouns, new names. We literally treat them as if they are the gender identity that they identify with. Then we have hormone therapy to block puberty, and the introduction of cross-sex hormones to feminize or masculinize the body. And after that, we have surgery to alter primary and or secondary sex characteristics. Again, Atkins makes the claim that these have been very successful, but again, cites no sources, no evidence. So here's essentially the process. According to several prominent trans activists and trans activist groups like the ACLU, the American Civil Liberty Union, the Human Rights Campaign, they say that children develop a transgender identity between the age of 2 to 4, and that young transgender children who are consistent, persistent, and insistent about their gender identity, those are the 3 conditions that you need to meet, that is what truly identifies a genuinely transgender child from one who's just playing make-believe, or it's just a phase that they're in. These people, the children that are, again, consistent, persistent, and insistent, that is all that's required. That it's a declaration that brings that identifies this person as a truly transgender child, truly deals with this gender dysphoria, rather than just a kid who is just playing make-believe. And so again, once a child has been identified as truly transgender, that is where the process begins. You name, you pronoun, you dress, etc. That starts at the age of, as early as 3 to 5. Then at the age of 10, when puberty typically begins, the child is put on puberty blockers. Because the argument is, if your body begins to develop sex characteristics that are incongruent with your gender identity, it will add to the mental and emotional distress. And so puberty is blocked for that purpose. Then at the age of about 16, they're introduced to cross-sex hormones, testosterone for transgender males and estrogen for transgender females. And then at the age of 18, they fully transition so their bodies match their gender identities. So there's the male to female transsexual person, gonadectomy, penectomy, and cosmetic surgery so the genitals match their gender identity. Same thing with the women, creation of a neopenis along with an urectomy, vaginectomy, complete hysterectomy, and a double mastectomy. And again, so this process literally begins at the very young age of sometimes 3 to 4, and transition is complete by the age of 18. Of course, every person is different. Transition occurs at different age, but this is what they claim is ideal. This is the ideal process. Parents and teachers are instructed to support their children by allowing them to live in a manner consistent with their gender identity, which helps them develop self-esteem and grow into happy, healthy members of society. And so, again, essentially what parents and teachers are being told is this: do you want your children to be happy? Do you want them to be flourishing members of society? And what you have to do is you have to acknowledge their gender identity is their true identity, and you support them in every which way. This is what you want to do. If you want them to be happy, you want them to thrive, you want them to flourish, then this is what you need to do. And again, what parent, what educator would not want what's best for their student and for their kids? And so again, this is a very brief, very general understanding of the ideology, what's being endorsed, the procedures that are being endorsed. Again, there's so much more, but I'm going to stop here for now, and then we'll move on to what I call the 3 appeals. Now, understanding this, again, the general ideas that are being promoted behind the movement, understanding the general proposed solution, I want to make 3 appeals for why I believe the ideology and the proposed solutions are actually detrimental to human flourishing. That these are bad ideas that lead to harmful results that really aren't brought to light, really. But philosophical appeals, again, by my educational background, I am more of a philosopher. I'm not a biologist. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a psychologist. And so in those data, I'm pulling from other people. I'm pulling from other sources. But as far as the philosophical people, these are the big ones for me, just because I believe that bad ideas will never lead to true flourishing. That when we see philosophical inconsistencies, when we note these internal inconsistencies, fragmented beliefs, unsupported philosophical claims, these do not lead to truth. I believe that the best way for human beings to flourish is first we have to conform our lives to the truth. And that is the way we flourish. Again, if we see that the trans activists are holding to a highly subjective, incoherent worldview, then we should be wary of their ideology. And so here's just a couple of things. I'm going to be somewhat quick, but just point them out. First, on the one hand, they claim that the real self is something other than the physical body, which is a form of ancient Gnosticism. Yet at the same time, most embrace a materialistic philosophy in which only the material world exists. And this is what I mean. And this is one of the big things that caught me, that was unsettling for me as I heard their rhetoric. They say things like, I am a woman trapped in a man's body, or I am a man trapped in a woman's body. What is the idea that's being expressed here is that this ideal, that I am identical to this immaterial self, and this physical body is just an add-on. Since I'm fundamentally identical to this immaterial self, the body doesn't matter. So if I don't like my body, then why not change it? Right? Body bad, immaterial self good, that is who I am. But here's the problem. Most trans activists, and a lot of people, especially the academicians, are also ardent materialists. That is, they don't believe that there exist immaterial entities. They hold that matter is all that exists. There are no gods, there are no spirits, there are definitely no souls, no minds. Most people reduce, in academia, reduce mental states to physical states, which is why they try to endorse this form of brain sex theory. But again, there's no conclusive evidence to support this position. So which is it? Will you hold to this form of Gnostic dualism where you have to acknowledge that there is this immaterial center of consciousness, volition, and will, what we typically call the soul? Are you going to hold to the existence of a soul, or are you going to stick with your naturalistic materialism that says the physical world is all that exists? Because you can't have an immaterial soul or an immaterial mind in a completely materialistic world. Second, they say that gender is a purely social construct, while asserting that a person or gender can be trapped in the wrong body. How can a social construct be stuck in a body? I feel like there is a categorical confusion here. Furthermore, if gender is a social construct, how can gender identity be innate and immutable, as doctors are saying? Because, again, how can one's identity be unchangeable and immutable with respect to an ever-changing social construct? The claim that, again, gender identity is immutable seems to be at odds with the claim that gender is also fluid. How do they bring those together? Third, with gender being fluid, one of the ideas that are undergirding this transgender ideology is that there is no meaningful social differences between a man and a woman. It's just a simple social construct. That's what separates men from women. What separates men from women is simply the fact that I feel like a woman and I feel like a man. That's the only difference. So while they promote this gender fluidity, they have to rely on a rigid sex stereotype to argue that gender identity is even a real thing. A real gender identity derived from a socially constructed gender framework. Again, we see that there is odds. There are odds here. Which leads to the question of, is there a gender binary or not? Somehow with transgender ideology, it does and does not exist. If the categories of man and woman are objective enough that people can identify as and be a man and woman, how can gender also be a spectrum where people can identify as neither male or female or both male or female, or it doesn't matter? Again, going back to the gender unicorn, doesn't that still enforce some type of gender binary where maleness and femaleness is highlighted amongst this third option? But if we demolish gender binary completely, then why is maleness and femaleness still represented as such? What does that even mean? Lastly, again, the main argument made by trans activists is that gender is purely in the mind, right? Gender identity does not exist in any objective or quantifiable sense. There's no physiological, legal, medical, or physical appearance criteria that a transgender person must meet to properly be distinguished as such. that reality exists solely in the mind of the individual making the claim. It's not a biological fact, but strictly on inner feelings. Well, if it truly is what's between the ears that determines gender and not what's between the legs, why is it the case that we have to conform our body to the mind? If gender is purely in the mind, why can't I just be a female with male genitals, or vice versa? If gender is strictly in the mind, why do I have to change my body? Again, they're still calling for some kind of bringing your identity to the physical body, all the while they're arguing they're not related at all. Do you see these kind of inconsistencies? So those are some metaphysical issues, but I believe there is also an epistemic issue. Again, epistemology has to do with knowledge. How do you know what you know? I think there's the epistemic issue of what does it even mean to have an internal sense of gender? Like, what does gender feel like? What meaning can we give to the concept of sex or gender, and thus what internal sense can we have of gender apart from the bodies that we particularly have? Precisely, how does a biological male come to know that he really is a woman? How does he arrive at this conclusion with what evidence to support it? Again, one of the things that I can't, again, maybe it's because I don't struggle with gender dysphoria, but I can't really come up here and tell you guys I feel like a woman trapped in a man's body because I've never been a woman. I don't even know what that even means. How do I articulate that? I think that is an issue. But not only are these issues that they have to address, but this is a reality determinant issue, I think. Why does their subjective feelings of gender dysphoria, why should that be a matter that determines objective reality? In other words, why should feeling like a man or feeling like a woman, whatever that means, make someone truly a man or a woman? Why do our feelings determine the reality of sex, but literally nothing else? Our feelings don't determine our race or age or height. If I were to stand up here and tell you guys that I feel like I'm a 6'7", 45-year-old African-American woman, for some reason, the only thing that sticks, the only thing that changes is my gender identity. That's what determines reality. What if people who identify as an animal or an able-bodied person who identifies as disabled? Should we be accepting of those that are trans-species or trans-abled? There is literally nothing in reality that we determine by our feelings. Ryan Anderson, he's well in this field as well, but he points out how gender identity can in a way be analogous to religious identity. Because even for the religious individual, our beliefs do not determine reality. Someone who identifies as a Christian believes that Jesus is Christ. Someone who identifies as a Muslim believes that Muhammad is the final prophet. Someone who identifies as Buddhist believes that there is no personal deity. We all have these different beliefs, but the matter of fact is this. Jesus either is or is not the Christ. Muhammad either is or is not the final prophet. There either is or is not a personal deity, regardless of what anyone happens to believe. You can hold to a false belief, but it's not your belief itself that actually determines reality at all. So a person either is or is not a man or a woman, regardless of what anyone happens to believe. In literally every area of our lives, we try to conform to reality, because regardless of what we feel or what we believe, reality is the truth maker for our beliefs. The last issue I want to point out, and this is not too philosophical, but it's just the inherent hypocrisy. It's a self-referential hypocrisy. They promote a radical, expressive individualism in which people are free to do whatever they want and define the truth however they wish, if they try to enforce acceptance of transgender ideology. It's a postmodern view of self with an objective implication for those who disagree. There is no truth. There is you can whatever you feel, that's the way it is, except if your feelings disagree with my feelings. Then you're a bigot. Then you're a transphobic. Then, again, this is how it's enforced. And listen to what, again, Ryan T. Anderson, he concludes, and these are the three realities about transgender activities that he says. He says, first, they are always changing their creed and expanding their demands. Yesterday's mandatory vocabulary will become tomorrow's epithets. Yesterday's enlightenment will be tomorrow's bigotry. Yesterday's requirements of science and medicine and justice are tomorrow's suicide-inducing oppression. Again, because again, it's constantly changing. Second, even as their own position shifts, the activists are absolutely closed off to contrary evidence. They call for the censure of honest researchers. They refuse to give any consideration to competing interests of privacy or safety. They reject alternative therapies that may be favored by parents or doctors. And third, because the transgender movement is so closed-minded, it inclines towards coercion. All of this suggests a posture of defensiveness that activists know their claims can't stand up to scrutiny. And again, not only is this a case philosophically, I believe that there can be a case scientifically, medically, and psychologically as well to reject this. From a biological standpoint, we are inherently sexed beings. According to modern embryology, from the moment of conception, we are sexed. At fertilization, a new human organism of a particular sex is created, either with XX or XY chromosomes. Again, as much as trans activists push for this language of sex assigned at birth, technically speaking, we don't arbitrarily assign gender at birth. We recognize and readily identify gender. Even while in the womb, through a grainy ultrasound, we can discern and recognize the sex of a baby. Again, gender is not assigned, it's recognized. And we know this down to the cellular level. Every cell in our body has a sex, and again, that has drastic implications on healthcare. There's a reason that why doctors, good doctors, honest doctors, still has to ask transgender individuals, what is your biological sex? What is your sex assigned at birth? Cardiologist Paula Johnson, in a TED Talk titled His and Hers Healthcare, speaks about how men and women are fundamentally different down to the cellular level. We respond to medication differently, that there's certain side effects and complications that affect men, but not women, and vice versa. One treatment that may work effectively for women won't not work for men. There are differences in the chemistry and structure of the brain, which affects our response to stress, medicine. Again, in her talk, she essentially argues for the importance of cross-gender testing for medicine and operations because men and women are different. Regardless of your regardless of your gender philosophy, when you are ill and the doctor puts you on the operating table, they still need to know your original biological sex in order to give you the best possible health care. And scientifically speaking, again, since we are inherently sex beings, you can undergo sex reassignment surgery, but from a biological standpoint, again, though there may be cosmetic changes, your sex hasn't changed. Cosmetic surgery, cross-sex hormones don't change the deeper biological reality, which begins with your DNA, fetal development, and unfolds in literally your bodily system. Another point of worry is the fact that puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones that we're injecting into children, this is all experimental at best. There's been no long-term studies, no research to provide us with the effects of having puberty stunted or having cross-sex hormones injected into our body. Medical professionals say that this is completely reversible, but again, there's no data to support this. None of this is FDA approved. The puberty blockers, drugs that are being used on kids, originally that is approved to block, it's used to help people with precocious puberty, children who are going through puberty so early that it's not normal. We stop it for a little while. It's not supposed to be used indefinitely because at the end of the day, again, this is all experimental. And as much as doctors love to say that this is fully reversible, it's just not true. Just a year of cross-sex hormones is enough to render an individual sterile for life. Moreover, the medical procedures that are being endorsed, I don't think that they're beneficial for psychological health. Because again, remember, parents are told that social transitioning, puberty blocking, cross-sex hormones, this is the only way for your child to be happy and flourish. But as we will see in a little bit, what parents are essentially being told is this: do you want your kids to commit suicide? Do you want your child to be depressed? No? Then this is the only way, because again, we understand that there is a significantly higher suicide rate in the transgender community. 41% compared to the average 4.6 of the general population. They argue that transitioning is the only way to prevent this. And again, though sex reassignment surgery has been shown to bring temporary satisfaction, there's no data to support that it actually promotes long-term mental health. What it actually has shown is the opposite, that there is no decline in the suicide rate post-transition, it actually increases. People say that it's because of the hatred that you're feeling. It's a continued hate, the discrimination that post-trans individuals experience, but that's not the case either. In the most trans-friendly country in the world, Sweden, people who have had the transgender surgery were shown to be 19 times more likely than the average to die by suicide. What this studies show is that depression, psychosis, suicide occurs frequently both before and after sex reassignment surgery, which should be an indicator that this does not work. And again, I want to make an emotional appeal, but I'm going to have to skip over this just for time's sake. But for now, when you guys have free time, I want you guys to listen to their stories. The trans activist stories, I want you to listen to what they say. Because this are those who transitioned and transitioned back, and they explain why. Again, trans activists love making these emotional appeals. Oh, how could you, let's do the loving thing. Let's help them through this. Let's support them in all their endeavors. I'd like to make the same claim. I think that I also want to love them and encourage their flourishing. I'm just saying that the way you're loving them is not the way to human flourishing. There's other ways, and I want you to listen to their stories. Again, every story is unique. Everyone's different, but here are a couple of things that emerges from these various stories. First, most people report feeling pressured into transitioning as if it's the only option. They regret that medical professionals never explored the underlying psychological issues that resided deep within. Again, they did these studies. Psychiatrists, they interviewed these people, and they found instances of past trauma, bullying, absentee parental figures, broken family, abuse, among other psychological issues with those who, again, struggle with gender dysphoria and transition back. The detransition because they didn't feel peace and wholeness they desired by changing their bodies. Rather, a lot of them, how they learned to get over this is when they addressed the past trauma, they overcame it and learned to live in light of their biological identities. Again, and as much as professionals, and this is key, listen, as much as professionals claim that gender identity is fixed and immutable, it's just false. The American College of Pediatricians points out that according to the DSM-5, as many as 98% of gender-confused boys and 88% of gender-confused girls eventually accept their biological sex after natural passing through puberty. Another study done by Vanderbilt University and London's Portman Clinic, 70 to 80% of them spontaneously lost those feelings. The children that dealt with this. Again, so what the data shows is that anywhere from 80 to 95% of children who show signs of gender dysphoria will grow out of it by the time they begin puberty. But again, remember, with the puberty blockers that they're put on, do we even give them an opportunity to grow into their bodies? We don't know. Maybe a case can be made that because of the neuroplasticity, the malleability of the brain, this is the external endorsement that keeps children to stay in the whole process. One individual, one detransition reports of how he wanted to stop transitioning actually, but he felt like he couldn't because of the pressure to continue through it. Pressure from the parents, pressure from the medical community, and those who endorse this transitioning lifestyle. We are encouraging children to make life-altering decisions that will leave them scarred and sterile, leaving a wake of emotional baggage. And the worst part is, again, they're being silenced. The transgender narrative promotes this idea that gender identity is fixed and immutable, which is why they have to silence these testimonies, because it contradicts what they're saying. And the sad thing is, those who transition back, they're called desisters or detransitioners. A lot of these trans activists are calling these people a myth, that these don't actually exist. They weren't truly transgender. That is the narrative that they have to weave to really account for the fact that detransitioning is on the rise. Despite the fact that sex reassignment surgery has not shown any signs of long-term mental health, they focus on it. They focus on the maybe one or two success stories, and they disregard those who are still hurting and crying. And again, I'm going to speed through this and maybe have time for Q&A, but as I said in the beginning, the question I want us to ask is how can we best love and support our transgender neighbors? How can we truly help them flourish? And what I want to see that what our culture is promoting isn't working. It's philosophically, biologically incoherent. Its medical and psychological studies show that it just doesn't work. Our trans neighbors are still depressed, suicidal, under psychological oppression. What is the best way to love them? And so let me just go through them. But first, Christians must respond by offering a positive biblical worldview that affirms the value of the body and the unity of the human being. At the same time, Christians should be the first to nurture and support kids who don't fit in by affirming the diversity of gifts and temperaments in the body of Christ. And this is from Nancy Piercy. But one of the causes for gender dysphoria is this. We have these rigid sex stereotypes, right? Guys like guns, girls like dolls. And when we see kids, a girl who likes playing with guns or a boy who likes playing with flowers, immediately they place themselves in one of these rigid sex stereotype boxes, and because they identify as one and not the other, they claim that that's what they are. When a little girl plays with trucks, enjoys playing football, she puts herself in a box of maleness. With a little boy who likes art or cultivating homemaking skills, he puts himself in a box of femaleness. Christians should be the first to help children understand that it's okay to not fit in to a certain gender stereotypical box. We need to tell children, hey, you can be a boy and like flowers. You can be a girl and like playing in the mud. We need to affirm that you can identify as your biological sex and enjoy what you enjoy. Pointing to people in the Bible like David, who would go off to war, cut off a person's head, and come back and play the harp and write poetry. We need to tell stories of people like Jacob and Esau. Esau was a man's man. Jacob wasn't. But did that make Jacob any less of a man than Esau? I'd like to get into these more, but time. We just need to recognize that there is a diversity in the body of Christ, and God's creative genius is on display. There is a way to appreciate God's creative work in masculinity and femininity without having to become narrow-minded. Second, Christians, what we need to do is teach body positivity. Again, under the influence of Gnosticism, dualism, it leads people to believe that your body is completely independent. It's just a piece of matter. The implications is your body doesn't matter. Well, matter doesn't matter. All that matters is the person's inner feelings or sense of self. Well, Christians must point out that God actually wants to relate to us in our bodies, loving our idiosyncratic shapes and sizes, our bodily quirks, our physical appearances, and God wants to love and interact with us not only spiritually, but in our entire beings. There's a reason why God created us as embodied souls, unlike angels that are purely immaterial. Yes, our current bodies are weak and frail, damaged by sin, but remember, at the end of time, all of creation, including our bodies, will be restored and renewed by God. When Christ rose from the dead, he rose in a bodily resurrection and says that ours will be like his. We need to instill this worldview that views the body as valuable. And then last thing, we'll go through it. A Christian psychologist named Mark Yarhouse proposes what he calls an integrated framework. This is really the framework that a lot of people use as they interact with transgender individuals. There's the integrity framework, which pretty much argues that your gender identity should match up with your biological sex. That's how you can live with integrity. That's how you can be whole. The disability framework identifies this incongruence as a reflection of the fallen world. It's a disability. We need to, again, it's a non-moral reality. We have to be compassionate. We have to love these people because, again, it's an effect of sin. They're disabled in that sense. And then the diversity framework, this is, again, there's a strong form, which deconstruction of gender and sex doesn't exist. And then there's a weak form that just reflects, just says that we should accept this diversity. And so evangelicals love the integrity framework, also the disability model, rejecting the diversity framework. On the other hand, trans activists favor the strong diversity framework. Those who are trans-friendly favor the weak diversity framework. And what Yarhouse kind of does in his book is he kind of integrates them all. And this is kind of what he wants us to do. Integrity of sex differences, we acknowledge that if you truly want to flourish, your gender identity has to match up with your biological sex. We can talk about this more later, but again, this is one of my main arguments because I hold to what's known as natural law ethics, form and function. They have to match in order to flourishing. Well, Q&A maybe. Compassionate management of gender dysphoria, that's what he takes from the disability framework. For so long, the church has shunned these people, called them outsiders, and we fail to be compassionate and loving towards them. This is a diverge. Okay, it's okay. It's whatever. But one of the reasons why the transgender movement has picked up so rapidly, and you look at it historically, it's really in the recent years, it's because the church rejected the trans community. Not just church, but the culture rejected them, evangelicals rejected them, and who picked them up? It's the LGBT, which is why it's the LGBT. Again, this is for a different conversation, but I believe that the philosophy undergirding the homosexuality and transgenderism are different. The issues underlying both are different, but at the same time, they picked them up because they understood the oppression that they felt, and they added the transgender people into their community, LGBTQ+. And as the LGBT grows, so does the transgenderism. But again, a lot of this happened because the trans people who had gender dysphoria were rejected by church. I think we have a role, responsibility to be loving towards them, view them as people, view them as lost people. People creating the image of God, marred by sin. And the same Jesus who died for us, died for them. The same Jesus who loves us, loves them, but they will never be able to experience that love until we bring the gospel to them. That is ultimately how any of this is fixed. It's through wholeness in Christ. And lastly, the diversity framework, it just talks about how we just need to be, in a way, find a place in our churches for those in the trans community, those who deal with this. These people who are asking questions like, where do I belong? Who am I? Who will understand and accept me? Again, the church needs to be the first people to embrace them with love, point them to truth, help them align, again, find their identity, not just in their sexual orientation, but their identity in Christ, and promote healing and wholeness this way. Again, so much more. I'm just going to stop it there. I feel like I pretty much wrapped the last half of it, and so hopefully, again, this will all be available, but it's 1 o'clock. I know you guys are busy, but if there's any questions, we can have time for Q&A. I'll be hanging out here afterwards. So if you'd like to chat, let's do it. So any questions? If not, then let me pray, if that's okay, and then we'll be dismissed. So God, we love you and we thank you for loving us, your mercy, your grace, your Son. Ultimately, what unites us here as a body is what you've done. Your blood that's poured over us, how your death covered our sin, how you brought wholeness, how because of what you have done in your sacrifice, we can identify as sons and daughters of God. And ultimately, that is the message that we have and want to bring to a lost and dying world. I think we're all struggling with issues of identity, issues of wholeness, issues of fulfillment, satisfaction. Ultimately, all of that finds its fullness in you. And so I pray for these students as they continue in their studies, as they interact with a lost and dying world out here. I pray that they'll bring a message of hope and wholeness and identity and just share your love to those they encounter. So God, I'm thankful for this opportunity. I ask that you will bless their continued studies, and it's through your Son Jesus that we pray. Amen.